Welcome to Stranger Things in the 1980s. My name is Vince Locke. I am your host. In this podcast, my guest and I take deep dives into the Upside Down, where we analyze each episode of the Netflix series along with related movies and books and examine them in the context of 1980s America. Today, friend and fellow stranger Amee Schmidt is back to talk about Stephen King's The Mist. Welcome back to Stranger Things in the 1980s. I'm joined again by Amee Schmidt. So, Amee, tell us about yourself if you want to.
All right. My name is Amee Schmidt. I'm an associate professor of English at Marshalltown Community College here in Iowa. I teach all things English and literature related, and I'm a super huge Stephen King junkie and super excited to be talking about The Mist today.
Yes, we are talking about The Mist. So, yeah, The Mist was originally published in 1980 as part of a horror anthology called Dark Forces, and then was republished in 1985 in one of Stephen King's anthology called Skeleton Crew. So 1980 was kind of a good year for Stephen King because he published Firestarter, and then he had a few other shorter pieces published in that year. As we talked about before on Firestarter, this is similar in that they both deal with issues of sort of mad science and government experimentation and the price that people pay because of that. Before we get into discussing The Mist, and we're going to talk about both the book and the movie, not so much the TV show, because I haven't seen the TV show and I hear it's not very good.
I haven't either.
Before we get into that, I want to talk a little bit about Drew Struzan. So, Amee, are you familiar with Drew Struzan?
I'm not, actually. Enlighten me.
You may not know his name, and I think this is true of most people. They don't know his name, but they definitely know his work. He is an artist who made all of the classic, iconic movie posters of the 1980s. So all the Star Wars posters, Indiana Jones, pretty much everything that Steven Spielberg produced in the 1980s, Drew Struzan did the poster art for it. He also worked with John Carpenter on a few projects, most notably The Thing, which we'll get to. And in the movie version of The Mist, of course, our hero here, David Drayton, is an artist. And in the movie version, it is the work of Drew Struzan that we see in David's studio. So
is it really?
It is.
That's so cool. That's so cool. Now I'm going to go back and watch again.
Absolutely. So if you look at the very beginning of the movie in the studio, you see some of Drew Struzan's iconic movie posters for some Stephen King pieces. The Green Mile is in there, The Shawshank Redemption. He is working on a painting for, it's one of the Dark Tower books, the Gunslinger, which is very clearly a reference to a Stephen King work there. But also featured prominently is the poster for The Thing, which we've talked about The Thing a little bit in relation to Stranger Things. We haven't really gone into depth with it, which we will, because that's one of the sort of foundational texts for season 3. But I think there's a lot of thematic resonance between The Thing, which if you're not familiar with, and we're talking specifically about the John Carpenter version of The Thing, there have been 3 film adaptations. It's based on a novella by John Campbell called Who Goes There? And it deals with a group of Antarctic researchers trapped at a research base in Antarctica while they are being terrorized by this alien monster which is the thing of the title, which very clearly parallels what's happening in The Mist, because we have a group of people stranded in a grocery store surrounded by this otherworldly mist that is filled with monsters terrorizing them. So it's another case of intertextuality in which knowledge of one text sort of informs or illuminates knowledge and understanding of a different text. I think that's a brilliant use of Drew Struzan's art in the movie.
Yeah.
Also, and I think it's really obvious, a connection to Stranger Things, because it is the same movie poster that we've seen multiple times in Mike Wheeler's basement. So yeah, Drew Struzan, if you're not familiar with his work, I mean, everyone's familiar with his work, right, but if you're not familiar with him, go look him up. He has a website, drewstruzan.com, where all of his classic illustrations, you can see all of them. And apparently you can also buy the original artwork, which I imagine is insanely expensive.
I was just going to say that's going to cost a pretty penny, right? Yes. But you can get poster reprints for...
Yes, you can get prints of them. But yeah, you can also buy the original work, which, oh, if only I had the money.
Right. I love it.
So, The Mist.
Oh my goodness gracious. So I just reread the novella, right? I read it probably 20 years ago, at least, maybe 25. I think I was in my late teens when I read it the first time. And then I've seen the film multiple times. So then when I went back and read The Mist book version, the first thing that pops out to me that I think is most compelling about the novella is actually David Drayden's voice, right? Like the first person narrator voice in the novella is really compelling, and it's the reason that we understand the themes of the way we do when we're reading it, and that why those themes, in my opinion, don't come across even remotely as well.
That's a good point.
In the movie. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I will say, I think the movie is really well made. I know a lot of people hate it. I think it's well made. I think it does a really good job of adapting the text, but obviously stuff is going to be left out. So
well, you can't,
yeah.
even a novella, you can't fit in a film. So that's, you have to think about the medium, right? So yes. What are we looking at? What type of medium do we have? Because even with a novella, and I think the print version's under 200 pages, right?
Yes.
I mean, there's a lot of information in that can't translate to screen.
Yes.
What they did with the film worked out well. There's a few little issues that I have with it, but I agree with you. Overall, that having, adapted that for a movie, I think worked out pretty well.
You're right. I didn't think about this, but it is written in the first person, which, based on my knowledge of Stephen King's work, he does that every so often in his short stories.
Yeah.
But not so much in the novels.
Not at all. No, it's almost like he straddles the line there in terms of his style. And what's interesting there is you get so much of Drayden's inner life because it's first person and we're like hearing what he has to say. And in the film or in the movie, you can't,
yes,
you don't know like what he's thinking. And I think you lose a little bit of some of these themes, right, that are definitely present in the novella. And for being a short novella, there's a lot going on, right? There's so much. There's a list of things to talk about, and I'm happy to start anywhere you want to start.
Okay. Let's just give a little context for the story in terms of, and we talked about this a little bit when we looked at Ghostbusters, but the whole idea of Lovecraft, the Cthulhu mythos, as sort of eldritch and cosmic horror. So do you want to address that?
In particular, this is another one of those things that I feel like there's a huge reference to Lovecraft and Cthulhu mythos in the novella. And what we see in the movie rendition is mostly just the Cthulhu type monster.
Yeah. And so, it's more implied.
It is, absolutely. And it's so apparent and so real, I guess in the main plot theme, right? This idea of cosmic, horror, right? Like this idea that otherworldly creatures can create, horrific stories. And I think obviously that's there in both, because it's clear, at least by the end of the movie, that what we're dealing with are aliens or some sort of scientific experiment gone wrong.
And I think the movie explicitly says that with the Arrowhead Project, what they were trying to do was open a window to another dimension. I think they don't really explicitly say in the novella.
They don't. In the novella, they talk about they mention the Arrowhead Project a
Yes.
lot more, but it's much more mysterious. We also don't get the same ending, which we'll get to in a little bit.
Yeah.
And I think the ending actually gives us more closure in the movie version
Yes.
and more of a horror thing, so that we're left with this big question mark, which I guess is Lovecraftian in a way, right? Like, so this idea that we don't know what's going on through the entire novella. The fear is generated through the lack of knowing, the mystery,
Yes.
the fear is built by the mist in reality, and the symbolism of it, right? And there's so much, I'm just gonna pop right into it, but there's so much symbolism happening in that mist, right? Like, it's the device, right? It's a device, and it's a symbol, and it's a character, right? If we want to go deep into it, that really frames, I think, a lot of the other themes, right? So we see the mist in the way that it's described as being unnatural, right? Like,
Yes.
so it's got straight lines, it doesn't
Yes.
sparkle in the sun, right? So it doesn't have any of these earthly qualities we expect from a fog, but does have sort of the shrouding quality of a typical natural fog, as in, dense water droplets, on the surface. But then this particular mist, the mist that we see come in after this magnificently large storm, doesn't have those qualities. So we immediately see Drayden telling us that it's not a natural thing. This is not a normal mist. This has sort of like a symbolic unknown to it, as well as this physical shrouding quality.
There is an almost intelligence to it. I stood there for a moment, first surveying the damage, then glancing out at the mist again. It seemed closer, but it was very hard to tell for sure. If it was closer, it was defying all the laws of nature, because the wind, a very gentle breeze, was against it. That, of course, was patently impossible. It was very, very white. The only thing I can compare it to would be fresh fallen snow lying in dazzling contrast to the deep blue brilliance of the winter sky. But snow reflects hundreds and hundreds of diamond points in the sun, and this peculiar fog bank, although bright and clean looking, did not sparkle. In spite of what Steph had said, mist isn't uncommon on clear days, but when there's a lot of it, the suspended moisture almost always causes a rainbow. But there was no rainbow here.
It's right, like that we think of white as light and hope in most symbols, but in this case, this mist being as white as it is terrifying, right?
Yes.
It's that blankness, it's that disorientation, right? It leads us into a lot of the themes that we see that happen in this novel. I think when like you mentioned that there's an intelligence to the mist, we see that happening more so when we get into town, right? When the mist comes in and sort of moves in almost like purposefully to shroud the people in the grocery store. And again, it's the mist that they're afraid of, but it's not, we find out later. I suppose there's no spoilers because anyone listening should probably have read this book. When they enter the mist, it's not the mist that kills them, although they think that it is initially, right?
Right.
The first man who comes in, can't remember his name, I'm not sure if he's named, but he's got the bloody nose.
Yes.
And he keeps saying something in the mist, something in the mist.
Something in the mist got John Lee.
Yeah, there we go. Thank you. It's again that unknown, that we know that it's something dangerous, but we don't know exactly what it is.
Right.
And that's
a suggestion that it's pollution, that it's toxic in some way. Going a little bit farther, there is speculation that it's atomic, maybe, or there's a suggestion that it's atomic, that it's filled with different atoms, right?
Oh yes. The character that is missing, that I missed most from the movie, is Billy. In the novel, or in the novella, in the story itself, he's such an amazing catalyst for the movement of the philosophy, right? So, and you bringing up the atoms reminds me that, he argued with Norton, right? Norton, was it Norton or the teacher?
It wasn't Norton. And this is a little bit of a backstory, talking about a gas station attendant who is kind of a conspiracy theorist amongst several people in this town, apparently. Talks about, the Arrowhead Project and the government shooting different atoms into the air, or shooting atoms into the air. And Billy says, well, the teacher says that, the air is full of atoms anyway, which of course it is. And this attendant who's a little bit drunk gets offended. It's like, well, I mean, different Adams. And
Yeah.
so that idea of different Adams keeps getting echoed throughout the novella.
Yeah, that's I definitely felt his absence, Billy's absence in the movie. In the movie, he's really just like this helpless non-character,
Yeah.
right? And in the book, he's so important because he acts as a mirror for Drayden, right? Like, so
Yes.
there's so much of what Drayden is hiding from everyone else that Billy says out loud. And so that I think that's one of those things I missed.
There is a little bit in the novella. It talks about how he sort of regresses into acting like a 2-year-old, which is directly stated in the movie, although it's, I think, with greater purpose in the story, that it serves the story a little bit more, because it plays into that theme of regression, which is referenced several times in the novella, which we don't really see in the movie.
I can remember 2 specific instances of regression. And so that is when Billy reverts to a 2-year-old, and then it's Drayden himself who says that he reverts himself to a 4-year-old.
Yes. Yes.
And then so I see that again, I feel that's directly connected to the mist symbol, right?
Yeah.
So what does this symbol do for us, right? So this fear that imparts, this unknown, is something that we have as children, right?
Yeah, that idea
that
of
we
that,
don't,
the darkness or the shroud, you don't know what's
Yeah.
in it.
right, exactly. And so then, and that pushes us into our, baser motives, like, when we're children. And so that's really interesting because we don't see Drayden do that in the movie, right?
Right.
We don't see that part of him. But I think that regression isn't that, like I said, I think all of these themes connect directly to the mist as an object and as a symbol. And I know you've just about found the third example.
Well, there is one example I'm looking at in the book. Ollie and David are talking a little bit about the Arrowhead Project.
Okay.
Ollie said, I stand by one of those registers all day long, and I hear a lot. And by the way, Ollie is one of my favorite characters here,
my God,
both
yes,
in the book
love him.
and in the movie.
I know. I was really impressed with how well they cast him. Yeah.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
All the spring, I've been hearing things about that damned Arrowhead thing. None of it good. The black ice on the lakes. I thought of Bill Giasti leaning in my window. Bill Giasti was the gas station attendant referenced earlier,
Yep.
blowing warm alcohol in my face. Not just atoms, but different atoms. Now these bodies hanging from that overhead pipe, the cocked heads, the dangling shoes, the tongues protruding like summer sausages, referencing the soldiers in the store who have hung themselves and committed suicide. I realized with fresh horror that new doors of perception were opening up inside. New? Not so. Old doors of perception. The perception of a child who has not yet learned to protect itself by developing the tunnel vision that keeps out 90% of the universe. Children see everything their eyes happen upon, hear everything in their ears range. But if life is the rise of consciousness, as a cruel work sampler my wife made in high school proclaims, then it is also the reduction of input. Terror is the widening of perspective and perception. The horror was in knowing I was swimming down to a place most of us leave when we get out of diapers and into training pants. I could see it on Ollie's face too. When rationality begins to break down, the circuits of the human brain can overload. Axons grow bright and feverish. Hallucinations turn real. The quicksilver puddle at the point where perspective makes parallel lines seem to intersect is really there. The dead walk and talk. A rose begins to sing. Terror opens up the minds or the doors of perception.
He even says that fear is the whiteness, right? Like there's that line.
Yes.
And that, I mean, is just a bullseye symbol, right, for the mist, right?
Yes.
And yeah, so I think everything about what you just read just says everything that we've been talking about, how those two things definitely connect, that terror is the way that we move into this regressed stage that we see so many of the people in this grocery store,
Right.
and the things that they do out of impulse, out of instinct. That's the word I was looking for. And I think, especially the two guys and the store clerk who want to go outside and clear the exhaust of the generator. I mean, again, they were, and Drayden even talks about it, like, this was this one thing, there's so much danger out there, and everything is sort of going crazy, that they went to their base instincts, right? This is the one thing that I can solve, even though, as far as Drayden was concerned, and even Ollie, it was the dumbest idea they ever had, but they were dead set on doing it because it was the way that they focused their minds, right?
It's something
the way that Ollie talks
it gave
later.
them agency, something that they could do in order to deal with the situation. And
Exactly.
that's one of the points where the movie does explicitly say the line from the book about that.
Yep.
Here's something that they have control over, and goddamn, they're going to do it.
Yep. And I think in the movie, Ollie's the one who says it.
Yes.
And in the book, Drayden's the one who thinks it.
Yes.
So I noticed that very, very distinctly, because I do remember, Ollie's got some great lines. They've definitely given him a little bit.
Yes.
He builds his agency, his courage a lot more quickly in the movie than he does in the book,
Yes.
I think. But yeah, I think that was a great move. Yeah, to be able to include that.
And so Ollie in the movie does take on that more philosophical kind of perspective that David articulates in the novella itself. And when we talk about regression, it's not just regression into a childhood state like we see with Billy and with David himself, but sort of regression to a more primitive state, in the sense that going back to, as you say, primal instincts.
And I think part of that connects to this tendency for people to follow, I'm going to say her name wrong. Is it comedy?
I think it's Carmody.
Carmody. I mean, but comedy works, right? So this is where they, so these people who at the beginning of this incident are all like, you are a crazy, crazy woman.
Yes.
And the more things progress, the more people are willing to follow her, because they are unable to think through it logically. They're unable to understand what's going on. So then they go back to sort of that idea of, that loss of control, and being willing to put that loss of control, out of their own responsibility by giving it away to, spiritual belief or her wild ramblings. That's another slight difference. So if we're talking about the novella, she's a loony tune, right?
Mm-hmm.
So she has a very mixed bag of religion and spirituality there. In the movie, she's pretty distinctly Christian. So I thought that was kind of an interesting change up of her character. Regardless, she is crazy, like a very, very much a crazy person. She, in both renditions, she decides that the best way to atone for what is happening to everyone is two sacrifices, right? And it's Billy and Amanda, and that she's like, yeah, well, we're going to sacrifice these people, and there are actual people who follow her in this idea. And at that point, you have to acknowledge that this is a kind of a different kind of regression, right? That it's a regression into believing in Santa Claus. I don't know.
Yes, definitely. And the movie does explicitly say that this is a very Old Testament kind of perspective, where it's all about offering blood sacrifice and paying for the sins of humanity through expiation, right? Offering sacrifice to God. And I think you're right in that the movie does make it much more explicitly Judeo-Christian. The book is more about viewing it from a more generalized spiritual aspect that's part Judeo-Christian, part even like Aztec or some older beliefs that there's a blood debt that must be paid. So I want to look at the introduction of Mrs. Carmody, or at least when she's first described in the book, because the movie makes her a bit younger than the way I imagine her. In the book, I viewed her as being a much older woman.
Me too.
David is speaking with Steffi, his wife. One tear tracked down her cheek. David, I'm scared. Come on, it's over. Is it? Last winter, in the late spring, they called it a black spring in town. They said there hadn't been one in these parts since 1888. They undoubtedly met Mrs. Carmody, who kept the Bridgeton Antiquary, a junk shop that Steph liked to rummage around in sometimes. Billy loved to go with her. In one of the shadowy, dusty back rooms, stuffed owls with gold-ringed eyes spread their wings forever as their feet endlessly grasped varnished logs. Stuffed raccoons stood in a trio around a stream that was a long fragment of dusty mirror, and one moth-eaten wolf, which was foaming sawdust instead of saliva around his muzzle, snarled a creepy eternal snarl. Mrs. Carmody claimed the wolf was shot by her father as it came to drink from Stevens Brook one September afternoon in 1901. So right away, we're being set up to connect her with this wildness, this death, this taxidermy. The expedition to Mrs. Carmody's antiquary shop worked well for my wife and son. She was into carnival glass, and he was into death in the name of taxidermy. But I thought that the old woman exercised a rather unpleasant hold over Steph's mind, which was in all other ways practical and hard-headed. She had found Steph's vulnerable spot, a mental Achilles heel. Nor was Steph the only one in town who was fascinated by Mrs. Carmody's Gothic pronouncements and folk remedies, which were always prescribed in God's name. Stump water would take off bruises if your husband was the sort who got a bit too free with his fists after 3 drinks. You could tell what kind of a winter was coming by counting the rings on the caterpillars in June or by measuring the thickness of August honeycomb. And now, good God protect and preserve us, the Black Spring of 1888. Add your own exclamation points, as many as you think it deserves. I had also heard the story. It's the one they like to pass around up here. If the spring is cold enough, the ice on the lakes will eventually turn as black as a rotted tooth. It's rare, but hardly a once-in-a-century occurrence. They like to pass it around, but I doubt that many would pass it around with as much conviction as Mrs. Carmody. So establishing her as being a very superstitious kind of figure.
Yeah, and the superstition is so broad, right? So, the counting caterpillar rings and the width of honeycomb in spring, right? These are all things that are not connected to Judeo-Christian,
Right.
belief systems.
Yes.
So we see her as we see her as having a much larger scope of superstition than what we see in the movie. And I think that's important, right? Because I do see her also as an older person. And that's the reason I think in the novella, I feel like the people who follow her, I believe it more because I see her as this older woman. We even get a description of her. I don't know exactly where it is, but I know she's described as having gray hair.
Yeah.
In the movie, she is, dark-haired woman in her 40s? Yeah.
I would say, yeah.
Yeah. So it's so we have a different sort of respect, at least for her age, and the fact that her wisdom extends beyond one mythology, right?
She's
So
like a
in
village elder.
Yeah, right. In the movie, she is just a person who ascribes to one mythology, right? That's the Judeo-Christian mythology. And then in the novella, we have more of a sense of her as having some sort of wisdom because she has this larger scope. I mean, don't get me wrong, she's still a lunatic. And the things that she wants to do are crazy, but I feel like I believe that these people would follow her.
Yes.
In this sort of situation because she's offering them a larger scope of spirituality.
Right. In the movie, they say, for those out-of-towners, Mrs. Carmody is known as being a little unstable. And the biker guy's like, yeah, no shit. What was your first clue? Which I think is hilarious.
Yeah.
I do want to look at another passage.
Yes.
Blood sacrifice. The words hung there, slowly turning. Even now, when I know better, I tell myself that then what she meant was someone's pet dog. There were a couple of them trotting around the market in spite of the regulation against them. Even now, I tell myself that. She looked like some crazed remnant of New England Puritanism in the gloom, but I suspect that something deeper and darker than mere Puritanism motivated her. Puritanism had its own dark grandfather, old Adam with bloody hands. Yeah. So yeah, she in the novella, she does have this impression of being a crazed old hag.
She might be one of my favorite characters because of I cannot think of the actress's name who plays her in the movie.
Marcia Gay Harden.
Marcia Gay Harden. She's so good. right?
She is so good, and you can tell she's having a lot of fun with that character.
Oh my God. And she's so creepy. Like she's so creepy in the movie. It's magnificent. So when I reread the novella, I'm seeing her, but I'm trying to reconcile her with the character in the novella. And I love them both, but they have sort of like this separate thing. But yeah, she just did just wonderful things, especially in, you know, what is it, the penultimate scene where, you know, they're screaming
Expiation.
Thank you, expiation. And you know, and she has that really twisted, dark-eyed, you know, crazed look on her face. And when she's shot, we're absolutely, in both instances, we know it, we feel it's incredibly justified.
Yes.
Right, that you had to shoot this person, otherwise many people were going to die.
And in the movie, David says to Ollie, "Thank you." Ollie says, "There was no other way." And David's like, "Yeah, that's why I said thank you."
Yeah. In the novella, Ollie says, "I murdered her. I just committed murder." And David goes, "Yes, that's why I thanked you." So
Yes.
that was a slight change, but that one stood out to me too, because it was sort of Ollie was more definitive about it in the book, that this, I just committed murder. So you knew, you know, that he didn't want to do it, right? Like that. In both senses, I think you get that.
So yeah, Mrs. Carmody's religion is very steeped in superstition. And I don't mean that in a negative way. I know superstition tends to have a negative connotation. We do get that sense of superstition and spirituality mixed in David himself, because there are places when he sort of seems to have visions that he sort of attributes to God as well.
Yep. And he's not super definitive about it all the time, because sometimes in the first example that we were discussing right before we came on air is when he has the vision, right, in the living room, and that vision happens in his dream, and he's not entirely certain about where it comes from.
Right. And well, there is two instances. He has that sort of vision when he sees Stephanie in front, Stephanie and Billy in front of the window. That's a waking vision, but he does have a dream.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. So yeah. Okay. And another dream.
See.
Okay. So there's two dreams. There's the one during the storm.
Mm-hmm.
So there's the vision while the storm is getting started, where he, you know, sort of has this like waking vision of the glass coming in, killing his wife and son.
Yeah. I found it here.
And then he has a dream. Okay. Then he has the dream that same night, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. One of those terrible visions came to me. I think they are reserved exclusively for husbands and fathers, of the picture window blowing in with a low, hard coughing sound and sending jagged arrows of glass into my wife's bare stomach, into my boy's face and neck. The horrors of the Inquisition are nothing compared to the fates your mind can imagine for your loved ones. And of course, that picture window does get blown in when the tree goes through it. And it does sort of presage what happens at the store with the plate glass windows getting broken by the bugs and these bird creatures coming in.
Absolutely. So, and we're talking about symbols. I know really briefly, we'll mention the fact that the storm is a foreshadowing symbol of sort of the onslaught of these experimental creatures that come flying through at the door.
About an hour later, it began to crank up again. For 3 weeks, the temperature had been over 90, and on 6 of those 21 days, the National Weather Service station at the Portland Jetport had reported temperatures of over 100 degrees. Queer weather. Coupled with the grueling winter we had come through and the late spring, some people had dragged out that old chestnut about the long-range results of the 50s A-bomb test again. That, and of course, the end of the world, the oldest chestnut of them all. That's actually not the passage I was thinking of. That pertains back to that idea of experimentation, which we will get into.
Yeah.
The other passage I was thinking of, I went downstairs again. All three of us slept together in the guest bed, Billy between Steph and me. I had a dream that I saw God walking across Harrison on the far side of the lake, a God so gigantic that above the waist he was lost in a clear blue sky. In the dream, I could hear the rending crack and splinter of breaking trees as God stamped the woods into the shape of his footsteps. He was circling the lake, coming toward the Bridgeton side, toward us, and all the houses and cottages and summer places were bursting into purple-white flame like lightning, and soon the smoke covered everything. The smoke covered everything like a mist.
He's got a premonition of the mist. I missed that
Yes.
the first time. What I did make a connection with is the enormity of God, right?
Yes.
And the connection to this dinosaur-like creature that they see at the end that is
Yes.
also stamping out, the world. That's pretty interesting.
And he talks about the cracking of the trees that he hears. And probably what's happening in his mind as he's sleeping is he's hearing the trees fall over because of the storm.
Yeah.
And his mind is sort of spinning that or interpreting that as God stepping on the trees.
I like that I just made that connection though. So as many times as I've read the book and watched the film, and we don't once again, we don't get his premonitions
Right.
in the movie. So a lot of this is sort of my mind mixing the two together.
So where do these creatures come from?
The Arrowhead Project, obviously.
That's what we're meant to conclude. And the
We are.
movie is much more explicit about that.
Much more explicit. So the passage you just read about the little chestnuts, right? So the idea that the people of the town are making these connections among all of the oddities that are happening, and guessing what is happening at the Arrowhead Project. And then once the mist comes in, once the storm comes through, there's all kinds of theories. I think my favorite is, and I'm trying to remember who said this, cannot remember at all, but that maybe the storm made something happen at the Arrowhead Project that let all of this out, which again creates that, the storm as being the catalyst for the mist, which is the shroud that brings more. And people are always trying to figure that out. Right?
Yeah.
What were they doing with those experiments?
So there is one passage. This goes back to Bill Giasti talking about the other different atoms. That was all Bill Giasti's theory about the so-called Black Spring, the Arrowhead Project. In the western part of Shaymore, not far from where the town borders on Stoneham, there was a small government preserve surrounded with wire. There were sentries and closed-circuit television cameras and God knew what else. So another reference to God there. Or so I had heard. I never actually seen it, although the old Shaymore Road runs along the eastern side of the government land for a mile or so. Then another passage says, Dick Mueller, our insurance agent, said the Arrowhead Project was an agricultural station the government was running, no more or less. Bigger tomatoes with a longer growing season, Dick said sagely, and then went back to showing me how I could help my family most efficiently by dying young. Janine Lawless, our post lady, said it was a geological survey having something to do with shale oil. She knew for a fact because her husband's brother worked for a man who had Mrs. Carmody now. She probably leaned more to Bill Giasti's view of the matter, not just atoms, but different atoms.
Lots of theories flying around there. And it is later on, right, when they start positing this all must have come from the Arrowhead Project, and how did it get out, and what is it? Then,
and so there is some debate about, was it the storm that caused something to go wrong, or did the Arrowhead Project cause the storm? What is the cause and effect there?
There seems to be a pretty definitive belief, particularly after the soldiers hang themselves. And I can't remember if they do this in the novella or not, but at least in the movie, we overhear the soldiers talking amongst themselves that, what did we do? Is anyone going to come get us? Oh, we knew this was going to happen, or something like that.
Right.
And so we get that, and then they kill themselves. And so that almost solidifies, at least for the audience, that it was in fact the Arrowhead Project. And there's a passage I'm sure that you have handy about another dimension.
I don't, because I don't think that's actually in the novella.
It isn't. Okay.
That is explicitly stated in the movie, though.
Right. Okay. All right.
Yeah, the novella sort of leads us in that direction, that interpretation. Although, and once we get to the ending, the point is made that there is no particular answer for this.
The other thing that obviously is worth talking about that leads us down this experimentation theme are the actual creatures themselves.
Yes.
Right? In the novella, for sure, I want to say, I'm not going to guess, someone starts to say, okay, oh no, I think it's Drayden. Drayden's thinking in his head, right? You know, that like it can't be just if someone had brought in a squid, even one of those giant squids,
Right.
it would die
Yes.
on land. So this can't be what it is. So he's making connections for us,
Mhm.
like between, you know, so this is a creature that looks something like a creature that lives in the real world.
Right.
And how can we understand it? And then we have these pink mosquito bugs type
Yes.
things that are very interestingly described in the novella, slightly different than the way that they are
Yes.
than the rendition in the movie.
Mhm.
And then we have some sort of bird animal that eats the mosquito
Right.
bugs. Right. And
These are
all of
not
these
things that exist in our nature.
exactly. And but we also see sort of some similarities between
Right.
earthly creatures that makes us think, okay, well, maybe these aren't things from a different dimension. Maybe they're not genetically
Hmm.
modifying tomatoes up there. They're genetically modifying mosquitoes and squids.
Interesting. I did not
Yeah.
make that connection, but that is a
Oh,
valid
yeah.
interpretation.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. That, you know, because, you know, that's it's Bill, right? His name, the gas station attendant. He's the one who brings that genetic modification into our brains.
Mhm.
And then later on, Drayden is thinking in his head, you know, well, that's, you know, a squid couldn't live on land. So now we're led down that path, I think.
Right. I was going along the lines of creatures from another dimension, partly, I think, because I'm just familiar with the whole Lovecraft aspect of the Cthulhu mythos, which, you know, we've talked about this before. Like, listeners aren't familiar with Lovecraft. There is this sort of overriding mythology referred to as the Cthulhu mythos, that there are parallel dimensions where elder gods exist. They used to be in our dimension, but they got pushed out, and they're always trying to find a way to come back into our dimension. So I connect the mist with what's happening with these creatures to that Lovecraftian Cthulhu mythos. So I think my mind just automatically went there, that we're dealing with parallel dimensions or Lovecraft horrors. But also, it is left open to interpretation. Is the mist coming through a portal to another dimension, or has the world in which they inhabit, Drayton and the others, have they been transported to another world?
Oh, I had not thought. I mean, obviously, because of the connection to Arrowhead,
Mm-hmm.
I was assuming, you know, like as in Stranger Things, right? That
Yes.
a portal was opened and it was spilling into our dimension. It is absolutely plausible, right? That this dimension had been sucked through into another dimension
Right.
as opposed to the other way around.
And I think there are clues or hints at that. For one thing, there is what's described as an earthquake in the store.
Yeah.
And the movie makes it very clear that it's an earthquake. It's more ambiguous in the book. And let me see if I can find that passage.
It really is more ambiguous in the book. And I had not thought of that at all. Honestly, for me, it was, you know, just something exploding out of Arrowhead. You know, that's where that came from, that it was just simply a seismic activity as a result of some sort of explosion of a universal portal.
And that's the way it, I think, is depicted much more in the movie.
Yeah, yeah.
I think they're more clear about saying that. So what's happening is, and they do depict this in the movie, you have the police sirens and the fire trucks going down the main road, and then the air raid siren goes off. And then there was a thud, an odd twisting thud that I felt mostly in my feet, as if the entire building had suddenly dropped 3 feet. Several people cried out in fear and surprise. There was a musical jingle of bottles leaning off their shelves and destroying themselves upon the tile floor. A chunk of glass shaped like a pie wedge fell out of one of the segments of the wide front window, and I saw that the wooden frames banding the heavy sections of glass had buckled and splintered in some places. So it's described not as an earthquake, but a thud or a dislocation in space where
And a
the
drop
ground
like
just
that.
drops out from underneath
Yeah.
them. Yeah.
And you know, I certainly noticed the sense of that drop, but I've never been through an earthquake. So I
Mhm.
just, you know, but that certainly makes sense that there was, you know, this sense of sinking or being sucked or dropped into another dimension. That's
Right.
That's really interesting.
And we're also told that that air raid siren that's going off doesn't wind down. It just cuts off in the middle.
Yeah, it just stops.
Yeah.
Oh, that's fun.
And so I saw that as a sense of transportation or teleportation into this other world.
And they can't get any of the radio stations from
Yes.
anywhere.
Well, they do get some radio stations, but not from the stations that are across the lake on the other side of the mist.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I think it because isn't later on, like at the end, he's thinking about what he was able to pull up on the radio and the very little that he was able to hear. But in the car, they can't get any of the stations while they're driving away.
Yes.
Still.
Yeah, there's another passage. This is closer to the end. So how come we didn't hear cars getting bashed around, screeching metal, breaking glass? Well, because I stopped. He had me. I don't know. Miller said, no way they were out of the parking lot when whatever it was hit them. I'll tell you what I think. I think we didn't hear any cars getting around because a lot of them might be gone. Just gone. Fallen into the earth, vaporized, you name it. Strong enough to splinter those beams and twist them out of shape and knock stuff off the shelves. And the town whistle stopped at the same time. I was trying to visualize half the parking lot gone, trying to visualize walking out there and just coming to a brand new drop of the land where the hot top with its neat yellow lined parking slots left off. A drop, a slope, or maybe an out and out precipice falling away into the featureless white mist.
When they pull out of the parking lot, do we see whether or not the cars are there? I don't think that we do.
In the movie, they're there. In
the movie, they're there,
yeah.
right?
In
but
the novella,
also in the
I'm
movie,
not sure.
Also in the movie, that conversation doesn't happen.
Right.
Right.
I know in the novella, as they're pulling out of the parking lot, David talks about wants to make sure that he drives by the front of the store so he can see the people, see them leave, which they do dramatize in the movie. But yeah, I'm not sure about the rest of it. What happens with the other cars there?
No, there's no mention of the other cars at all.
So is there?
Yeah, because he gets in the car, so that he's going towards the grocery store. Some urge, probably a base one. There we go, a base urge. You know, we're back to regression. Made me cruise past the Federal Market as close as I could get. The Scout's right bumper bunted the trash barrel to one side. It was impossible to see in, except through the loopholes. All those fertilizer and lawn food bags made the place look as if it were in the throes of some mad garden sale. But at each loophole, there were 2 or 3 pale faces staring out at us. Then I swung to the left, and the mist closed impenetrably behind us. And what has become of those people, I don't know. I drove back down Kansas Road at 5 miles an hour, feeling my way. And then we start to get the description of the broken roads and what has broke them. He does not know. Yeah, we see nothing of the actual parking lot itself. Right. That's fun. That's a fun read right there. I like it.
Yeah, so the way I read that is, they were transported into this other dimension, into the upside down, as it were.
Into the upside down. Oh, I love that. Yes, absolutely. And there's a lot of places he can't get to while they're trying to drive out of town, right? So there's a lot of alternates. So that's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Cool.
So now we're moving more towards the ending. And is there anything you want to mention before we get to that point?
No, I think I'm ready to talk about the ending if you are.
Okay, yeah. So there is a pretty big change in the ending between the novella and the movie.
Huge.
Yes. So, and I do want to just read the very last parts of the novella. That is what happened, or nearly all. There is one final thing I'll get to in a moment. But you mustn't expect some neat conclusion. There is no, and they escaped from the mist into the good sunshine of a new day, or when we awoke the National Guard had finally arrived, or even that great old standby. It was all a dream. It is, I suppose, what my father always frowningly called an Alfred Hitchcock ending, by which he meant a conclusion and ambiguity that allowed the reader or viewer to make up his own mind about how things ended. My father had nothing but contempt for such stories, saying they were cheap shots. And I do want to pause here because I do want to mention that I know exactly what he means by the Alfred Hitchcock ending. I hate those endings because Alfred Hitchcock movies just end. There is no resolution. There is no explanation. It's just, it ends. And you don't know why it all happened or ultimately what happened. Yeah, those suck. This ending, he does describe it as an Alfred Hitchcock ending in the sense that there is no explanation for what ultimately happened, but there is a sense of denouement, which Alfred Hitchcock movies don't give you. We got to this Howard Johnson's near exit 3 as dusk began to close in, making driving a suicidal risk. Before that, we took a chance on the bridge that spans the Saco River. It looked badly twisted out of shape, but in the mist, it was impossible to tell if it was whole or not. That particular game we won. But there's tomorrow to think of, isn't there? As I write this, it is 1:45 in the morning, July the 23rd. The storm that seemed to signal the beginning of it all was only 4 days ago. Billy is sleeping in the lobby on a mattress that I dragged out for him. Amanda and Mrs. Ruppler are close by. I am riding by the light of a big Delco flashlight, and outside the pink bugs are ticking and thumping off the glass. Every now and then there is a louder thud as one of the birds takes one off. The Scout has enough gas to take us maybe another 90 miles. The alternative is to try to get gas up here. There is an Exxon out on the service island, and although the power is off, I believe I could siphon some up from the tank. But it means going outside. If we can get gas here or further along, we'll keep going. I have a destination in mind now, you see. It's that last thing I wanted to tell you about. I couldn't be sure. That is the thing, the damned thing. It might have been my imagination, nothing but wish fulfillment. And even if not, it is such a long chance. How many miles? How many bridges? How many things that would love to tear up my son and eat him, even as he screamed in terror and agony? The chances are so good that it was nothing but a daydream that I haven't told the others, at least not yet. In the manager's apartment, I found a large battery-operated multi-band radio. From the back of it, a flat antenna wire led out through the window. I turned it on, switched over to BAT, fiddled with the tuning dial with the squelch knob, and still got nothing but static or dead silence. And then, at the far end of the AM band, just as I was reaching for the knob to turn it off, I thought I heard, or dreamed I heard, one single word. There was no more. I listened for an hour, but there was no more. If there was that one word, it came through some minute shift in the damping mist, an infinitesimal break that immediately closed again. One word. I've got to get some sleep. If I can sleep and not be haunted until daybreak by the faces of Ollie Weeks and Mrs. Carmody and Norm the bag boy, and by Steph's face, half shadowed by the wide brim of her sun hat. There is a restaurant here, a typical Hojo restaurant with a dining room and a long horseshoe-shaped lunch counter. I'm going to leave these pages on the counter, and perhaps someday someone will find them and read them. One word. If I only really heard it. If only. I'm going to bed now, but first I'm going to kiss my son and whisper 2 words in his ear, against the dreams that may come, you know. 2 words that sound a bit alike. One of them is Hartford. The other is hope. So that's the end of the novella.
Yep.
There are some survivors.
Yes.
David and his son survive along with Amanda and Mrs. Ruppler, and they're out in the world, apparently on their way to Hartford. Mm-hmm. And that's the end. The movie's quite different. Do you want to describe the movie ending?
Yeah, so the movie ending, number one, is interesting because they get on the road. We don't see a lot of the landscape, right? Mm-hmm. Instead, we're just inside the Jeep, right, that he has. Yeah. And there are 5 people
Yes.
And what's very important about the plot there is when they stop and check, there are 4 bullets in the gun that
Yeah.
David has risked his life to get, right?
Yes.
They run out of gas and they're still in the mist. And then David makes the decision to shoot everyone in the head.
Yeah.
In order,
and there is it's sort of tacitly understood that the adults there agree to it.
Yep. And Billy is sleeping, right? So this is him trying to make things better for his son. Like, so we hear him say things about, things being outside to tear my son apart.
Yeah.
We see that in the actor, right? And we understand the adults in the car are, aware that this is the what's the word I'm looking for? The humane way to go out right now, right?
Yeah.
That instead of leaving the car and being torn apart by monsters, dying this way is better.
Right. It is sort of set up a little bit in the movie because Billy does say to David, "Don't let the monsters get me. Promise me that."
Yep, absolutely. So David does. He's only got 4 bullets, and they ask him, "What are you going to do?" He says, "I'll figure it out." After he kills them all, including his own son, he has this massive breakdown, walks outside of his truck and starts screaming at the monsters to come rip him apart. And 30 seconds later, the mist actually begins to lift. And we do see what King has said is this cliche ending where the National Guard has come in.
Yes.
And there is this like huge, like,
and there is the sunshine of the new day.
Yes, and that this is the conclusion that King says he's not, that Draymond, the narrator, says he's not going to have. So I think that's pretty funny. But what isn't, your typical ending is that the psychological terror for Draymond now is tenfold, right?
Yeah.
Because he's literally just killed his son after trying to save him for such a long time, and seconds later,
seconds later, that's the irony. Yes,
it is. Yeah. And I think that for me is really this absolute horrific ending. It's so much more horrific than what happens in the novella.
It is unbelievably bleak. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And I mean, even though the world is going to be saved because we see the National Guard and all of these massive military forces fighting the monsters, that now we know David has to live with having killed his own son.
Yes. The movie ending leans really into that typical sort of Lovecraftian kind of madness that comes from being exposed to these otherworldly horrors.
And I think that's very, very funny because he actually says that this is not going to be, there is no, and they escape from the mist. There is no National Guard. There's no, it was all a dream. Yeah, so
the Hollywood movie ending. Yeah,
exactly. You did tell me that King prefers.
I had heard that Stephen King does prefer that ending to the movie,
which I think is kind of hilarious.
Right.
Because he's the one who. But then also, this is retrospect. So he wrote the novella in 1980, and the movie was made in 2007.
Yes.
So that's 27 years of thinking about a story you wrote. I'd be changing the ending too.
Right. And it's kind of a running joke with Stephen King's work is people tend to complain about his endings. Yeah. And if you saw the recent film version of It, in which Stephen King does appear, there is that joke, that gag in there, in which the writer character, who's based on Stephen King, everyone hates his endings. And even Stephen King says, "I hated the ending."
That's great. That's great.
So the movie, and I mentioned that the movie gets a lot of hate. A lot of people hate the movie. It was not critically well received. I think it is a good movie. I think it's very well made.
Yeah.
I don't know that I would say that I enjoy the movie because it is so bleak. It's not the kind of movie one enjoys, I don't think.
But it's psychologically stimulating.
Yes.
In sort of a terrible way.
But
it does get you thinking about a lot of themes. Yeah, for sure.
I think it is very engaging in a sense that you really can't look away from it. It does grab you.
It does. Absolutely. Yeah. They definitely did not come up with any kind of light at the end of the tunnel for that.
Yes.
Not at all.
So how does the mist connect to Stranger Things?
Oh my gosh, how does it not?
Yes.
So we have Cthulhu reference, which I absolutely connect in so many ways to The Thing, right?
Yes.
And so we see that happening in both of those. You've mentioned the Upside Down. I think that that's there
Yes.
for sure. And then experimentation, right? I'm sorry,
Hmm.
Hawkins Lab and Arrowhead are
Yes.
literally, I feel like Stranger Things just copied, right? No, but
Yeah.
it's really a thing that we see happening in both Stranger Things and in this film. And it's
Hmm.
in the film, in the novella. So that idea of secret experimentation,
Yeah.
particularly in the 80s, and like the fear of that and sort of the reality of how that can change
Yes. And
and more
considering
from
that this was 1980, which is the same year that Firestarter was published, you can
yeah,
definitely tell where Stephen King's head was at in
yeah,
1980.
yep.
And then season 2 of Stranger Things, the main evil force is the Mind Flayer, who is
Yes.
very Cthulhu-esque.
Absolutely. Yeah. I didn't think of that. Yeah. Because the Mind Flayer doesn't have tentacles all the time.
Hmm.
But when it does, absolutely. That's, yeah. And it's sucking, the life out
Yes.
of people quite literally. Yeah.
Hmm.
Uh-huh. Nice. Yep.
Yes. So
Mm,
yeah, I think the connections to Stranger Things are really quite obvious. And
they
I
are.
think you
Yeah.
can see that The Mist is hugely inspirational for especially the second season of Stranger Things.
Yeah.
It's one of the
Oh,
fundamental foundational texts that influences the second season.
I mean, and you can see just the symbolism of the mist, right? It's the darkness, right, that we
Hmm.
see in season 2, but it's still that shroud, right? Like that
Yes.
shroud absolutely exists as part of that. Cool.
So are you familiar with games, video games, all that much?
Few, but
Okay. So there is a video game series called Silent Hill, which did get adapted into a couple movies. The original Silent Hill game is very influenced by The Mist as well, because it's about this little town that's isolated, cut off from the rest of the world. There's this mist, this fog that obscures everything. And periodically, there are these sort of shifts in reality between dimensions. And there is one of the main antagonists of the original game is this crazed old woman with her religious beliefs. And it's like, oh my God. And in fact, there are references in the game to Stephen King's pseudonyms.
okay.
Like the names of the streets are like Bachman Drive and stuff like that. I'm like, yeah,
Nice.
this is very obviously drawing on The Mist.
That's
So
very
if you
cool.
want to play The Mist, play Silent
Like
Hill.
Silent Hill. Okay, I'm gonna keep that in mind. That's killer.
Any last thoughts?
I don't know. So I absolutely I think that I prefer the novella,
Yeah,
right?
me too.
I think that despite the similarities, they're almost two different elements, right? Like that, what they did in the adaptation, the screenplay adaptation, was really focused on, like a manageable number of themes. And they changed sort of the overarching theme into this bleaker thing.
Hmm.
What I prefer more about the novella is the voice, right? Like just the
Yes,
voice of the narrator and King's description. I'm just glad
yes,
we had an opportunity to read out loud, because in my opinion, early King is the
yes,
best.
yes, me
Everything
too.
that he wrote before 95 is basically gold, right? He turned into sort of like this machine, right? Where he's pushing out novels at an
Uh,
unbelievable pace, but they don't have that same power, right? That I think his early stuff
Right.
does.
And I would argue like mid 80s is where it kind of falls off for me by the time you
Oh,
get
really?
to The Stand and It.
Yeah.
He starts to get really verbose and sort of
Yeah.
overwrought in his descriptions, whereas early King is very lean and very readable.
I mean, there's some of that later stuff that I enjoy those intense
Mhm.
descriptions, but
Oh,
that's,
I enjoy
like,
them. It's
yeah,
just, yeah,
that's
there is a
it's a different
definite
style.
progression, a different style. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think and as he progresses later, like his books become incredibly formulaic. And for me,
Yes.
they're just too predictable. But I will forever, be a Stephen King fan because I started reading him when I was young. My mom was a big collector. So I have her Stephen King collection in its little pieces. So
Nice. Okay, so I think that's going to be it for this episode. For the next episode, we're going to talk about the Pollywog episode of Stranger Things, and we're going to talk about camcorders. So what were camcorders and how do they influence modern life? Thanks for joining us as usual. Thank you, Amee, for coming back.
Pleasure.
Until next time, as always, take it easy, take care, and stay strange. Stranger Things in the 1980s is produced by Dread Pirate Productions. Cover art is by Sherry Archer. The theme music is Cobalt by Alex Bloxam, used under license from Filmstro. Send questions or topic suggestions to dreadpirateproductions@gmail.com.